Right. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. My name is Julie Squire. I am a senior partner at Bellwether, where I specialize in policy analysis and have done work in the charter sector nationally, although not as much in New Orleans. So excited to learn from our panelists today all about that. This is the second session in our webinar series about the education sector in New Orleans, how things have changed since Hurricane Katrina made landfall almost 20 years ago, and also where it stands today. Our conversation today is going to focus on the charter sector in New Orleans, how it grew and evolved in response to Katrina, as well as the role it plays today. Um, for those of you who are new to Bellwether, we are a national nonprofit. We work with a range of organizations, school districts, charter networks, state agencies and other nonprofits to help them solve challenges and create learning experiences for young people. A few housekeeping items before we jump in. First, feel free to ask any questions you have in the question box. We'll leave time to answer as many of those as we can at the end. If you wish to leave early or if you just want to play back a piece of the conversation, we are recording this and we'll post it online afterwards and share that recording back with you. And lastly, if you're interested in learning more, we have one more webinar in this series of conversations with leaders, policymakers, and experts who have helped shape the education system in New Orleans during the past 20 years. And we will put more info about that into the chat. Thank you all so much again for joining us. I am excited to get started with our panel today. We have three experts with us, Leslie Jacobs, Dana Peterson, and Jim Pizer. Leslie Jacobs served as an elected board member of the Orleans Parish School Board and for 12 years on the Louisiana Board of Elementary and Secondary Education. She was deeply involved in the creation of the Recovery School District and in building a successful system of schools in New Orleans for over 20 years. Dana Peterson is the CEO of New Schools for New Orleans. Dana formerly served as the Assistant State Superintendent in the Louisiana Department of Education, where he helped to lead the Recovery School District and the Baton Rouge Achievement Zone. And then last but not least, Jim Pizer. Jim is a senior advisor here at Bellwether. He was formerly the Massachusetts Secretary of Education under Governor Charlie Baker from 2015 to 2022. And prior to that was a managing partner at New Schools Venture Fund. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I'm excited to get started and would love to begin by sort of anchoring us and our audience in the time that Katrina hit, and what the charter sector looked like in New Orleans at that time, and also what roles you were in at that time. Dana, maybe I could start with you.
Yeah, well, great. Thank you, you guys at Bellwether for hosting this, and thank you, Julie, for being with us. You almost got some New Orleans street cred by the way you pronounced it there too at the outset. So,
Just a little.
yeah, just a little bit. You're
Yeah.
close. So in 2005, when the storm hit, of course, I'm not born and raised in New Orleans. I moved here in 2003. And I was working as a political consultant in the city. So I wasn't directly involved in schools, but I had been involved and paying attention to, of course, the politics of the city, of which the public school system was a significant part of. The discussion around it, of course, was pretty rich in the years leading up to the storm. There were been well documented the challenges that the system itself faced, and they very much had some roots in the politics of the city. So that was my role as the storm hit.
Jim, how about you?
So at the time, I was a partner at New Schools Venture Fund, and New Schools Venture Fund was and is a nonprofit venture philanthropy. So we aggregate, philanthropic resources from a variety of funders, philanthropies, high net worth individuals, that sort of thing, pool it together in order to support education entrepreneurs, primarily in urban settings. And at the time, we were heavily focused, and I in particular was heavily focused on supporting investments in the charter sector, and in particular, the development of charter management organizations concentrated in urban centers. And I was focused at the time on places like Boston and New York and New Jersey and Chicago. And then we can talk some more about how New Orleans came on the radar screen. But importantly or interestingly, it was not really on the radar screen before. Even though there was a charter school law, the RSD existed, the RSD had done some chartering, or at least had begun to do some chartering. So it was, in many ways, a vibrant and growing charter sector, but was not necessarily the focus of national philanthropy at that point.
Great. And Leslie would love to hear from you too.
Yeah, so I was on the State Board of Education and had in 2003, we passed legislation that created the Recovery School District. And there was recovery from academic failure. It had nothing to do with Katrina. So that's one of those misunderstood things. And Dana mentioned the politics. To pass the Recovery School District, it required a constitutional amendment to be passed in the legislature, as well as then a majority vote of the people. So when the levees broke, we had one charter school originally in New Orleans Charter Middle School. Some audience may know Jay Altman. And that was the first charter school in the state and the only charter school in New Orleans. In 2004, after the legislation passed, we had our first school in the Recovery School District, and 4 more were opening up in August 2005. And we're in session a couple weeks. Most importantly, one of those schools was KIPP. We had gone out to recruit KIPP out in California, and that was our only national school, so to say. The others were homegrown. So there were a total of 6 charter schools. Only 2 had really been in operation when the levees broke.
Got it. Wonderful. Thank you for that history and just helping us ground at sort of where things stood at the time, August 28th, 2005, and then would love to move after August 29th, 2005, the day that Katrina hit or made landfall. Leslie, keep staying with you for a minute. In the days, the weeks, the months, the years that followed, what were the key factors that led to the creation of an all charter system in New Orleans?
So I'd say the first thing, I'm flying back. I mean, as everybody evacuated, I had my 99-year-old grandmother I had to evacuate. I had to move my daughter into college. I'm flying back from Philadelphia to Lafayette, Louisiana, crying on the plane, thinking, oh my God, my city's destroyed. And the next day meeting with Cecil Picard, the state superintendent, to say, this is how you can amend the Recovery School District legislation so we don't let the school board reopen these schools in the same bad state they were before the storm. So from that, lots of things happened. We had to persuade people to amend the Recovery School District legislation. We had a meeting, and Jim, I don't know if you were invited, I don't remember, but there was a meeting in Texas, and we had a bunch of education experts in there. And it was to discuss what should the state do with the schools. And the recommendation from lots of people was for the Department of Ed to build a traditional school district and show how you could run a traditional, well-run urban school district starting from scratch. Well, those of us there rejected that notion because we did not believe the Department of Ed was set up to run schools. So a key decision was we were going down the charter path. We had to work with the governor in a special session to suspend the law that required to convert a charter, you needed a majority vote of the parents and the teachers. This was critically important because one of the things people miss is the first charters to open were the few in the RSD and the Orleans Parish School Board. Of the 16 schools they kept, I worked extensively with them to flip 12 of the 16 into charter schools. Senator Mary Landrieu worked with Margaret Spellings and Secretary of Education to get us $27 million, I think it was, of unspent national charter school money that we then worked with US Ed to use that money to make up the loss of local revenues. Again, the city is shuttered. There's no local taxes. And so we could use the suspension of the law and that federal funding to persuade the Orleans Parish School Board to grant charters to their schools that were reopening. And so those schools reopened, and they called back their veteran educators there and were opened. So in terms of coming up with an all charter district, I think folks minimize how critically important it was that the school board immediately became an authorizer, much more so than an operator. And that tradition continued when the schools returned to local control. The other big decisions, and there were a lot going on, but we determined to be an all-choice system. And that wasn't from philosophy. It was because there was only the river sliver of the city that was open. And so for the years after the storm, as people had to build housing and move in various parts of the city as it came alive, we did not want kids to have to keep changing schools. The next thing we did, I had been on the school board, Orleans Parish School Board, and my focus had always been finances. I worked with the head of the state finance, and on the back of a napkin said, we have to have a weighted funding formula because these schools are going to have special ed. So we did a very basic weighted funding formula out of the gate, which again was very important in setting that precedent. And then a big fight was to push actually the Department of Ed to take the federal recovery dollars that were coming in and not to spend it all themselves, but to allocate on a per student basis money to those in charter schools. Again, this all set a precedent of how things were going to operate. And then the last one was that I picked is we hired NACSA, National Association of Charter School Authorizers, to review our charter applications, and a group of us made a decision we were going to stick with quality over speed. So the plan was in 2006 at the start of school, it would be all charters in the Recovery School District. We had 44 charter applications, and NACSA only approved 4 of them. So that's how we ended up direct operating, because we had to scramble because kids were back, and we had to pop open schools. And they weren't of the highest quality. But those are some of the things that really were happening from September to May.
Yeah. Wow. So much happening at that time. And so much decision making, it seems like, is happening at the state level, at the local level. And then you already mentioned KIP, and I know there were external partners that were coming in from outside of the city to try to support. Dana, Jim, would love to hear from you, sort of what in particular, and you as well, Leslie, what role did leaders play within the city, and then externally to New Orleans in the recovery effort and the emergence of an all charter system?
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, Leslie raised a lot, right? And you could spend an hour just clicking on one of those issues that she raised and have a full discussion about it. I think for me, a through line in all of it of how I think people look at the system that we have today. It is one of the most unique, I would say, progressive, small p progressive school systems in the entire country. Much of what Leslie talked about, differentiated funding formula, centralized enrollment system, parent choice at the heart of it, accountability for outcomes for young people. But it's hard to draw a straight line from August 30th, 2005 to today. There's a lot of nuance to the story. To me, a lot of things happen, though, pragmatically. If you go back to 2006, we actually were having a mayor's race in 2006 after the storm. And I remember, of course, Mitch Landrieu becomes mayor later, but loses that election. But I remember in that election, he talked a lot about, in order for the city to get back on its feet, 3 things needed to be true for people to return to the city. You needed your job to be back online. You needed a house and home. Either your home had to be not impacted or flooded, or a FEMA trailer out in front of your house while your house was being repaired. And then that third leg was you needed a school for your child to go to. And so this idea of schools needed to come back online, they need to come back online fast in order for the city to repopulate. So educators played a really, really critical role in the resurgence, if you will, of New Orleans. But as Leslie said, pragmatically, you could only have schools in certain neighborhoods in those early years. So you could not have geographic priority and I'm sorry, geographic assignment and boundaries. So it's something that started out pragmatically, but over time essentially became a real value that we relied upon, right? We want young people and families, and today the way we explain it, right? You don't want anybody to be limited by what they can where they can afford to live, but it started out very much as a pragmatic piece. It was easier for a lot of schools to come back online also as charters, as those veteran educators to really restart schools, attract teachers, veteran educators back to their schools. Those are some of the schools that became the most populated in the early years. I think, again, a very practical piece. A lot of stuff happened very pragmatically. They were the sort of best decisions at the time to address the ecosystem that was constantly evolving and growing and reshaping itself. There was no, despite high level discussions, I'm sure there was no real blueprint, if you will, at the outset. A lot got developed on the fly. A lot of things were tried. Some things didn't work. A lot of things endured. Those things that endured, Leslie talked about, were codified in law and policy, and you have what you have today. But I think another critical element of this is it is the result of so many different hands and people involved in reshaping our public school system. You have charter school leaders, you have folks like Leslie, who were supporters and are really heavily involved. You have lawmakers, policymakers, both locally at the state level and at the federal level. Folks, Leslie mentioned Senator Landrieu. We wouldn't have a $2 billion settlement from FEMA to rebuild public schools the way in which we did without that type of leadership. So there's a lot of different hands, I think, that contributed to what you see today in the rebuilding of it. And you could take, again, any one of those pieces or issues and double click on it for hours, naming the people who contributed. But I think we've been very fortunate in that way, from volunteer to local elected to contributor. We've benefited from a lot of hands.
And maybe just sort of further double clicking or doubling down on Dana's comments and Leslie's as well. First, obviously there was just a huge crisis and sense of urgency and need to act quickly. This was sort of perfectly designed for an entrepreneurial approach to restarting a school, to figuring out how to make it work when the systems and the infrastructure had broken down. So there were very good pragmatic reasons for moving in the charter direction and moving forcefully in it. As Leslie suggested, I think it was part strategy, and Leslie in particular, I would say, had the sort of vision to understand that a charter sector could be important, not just in getting schools back up and running quickly, but also in building a new kind of system in New Orleans that hadn't existed before. But there was not unanimity. So you talked about that Houston, I think it was at the airport, the Houston
Airport.
meeting.
Were you there?
I think this is one of those things. I don't know. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. It doesn't matter anymore. And also I would say both that conversation and the Bring New Orleans Back Commission, sort of, which was, like a big exercise. And Boston Consulting Group was brought in to kind of lead the analysis and that sort of thing. And they came out with a big report. And it was, on paper, great. It was a great report, very thoughtful. But the focus was on sort of building a portfolio district that was, a hybrid of charters, non-charters, district-run schools, but largely managed centrally, if you will, in a way that, again, looks good on paper, and I fully endorse and embrace for many other places and other times. But didn't quite fit the specific circumstances in New Orleans, and nor did it fit the history of the school district there, which, at that point in time, there had been, I think, 8 superintendents in 7 or 8 years. They were under essentially a fiscal receivership. They had lost almost a quarter of their enrollment over the course of the prior, 6 to 10 years. And the RSD itself, which I don't know, Leslie, you might remember. I don't know how many employees they had in the office within the State Department, but it was a handful of people. So it wasn't like there was this big capacity that could be, turned on by flicking a switch. There was sort of nothing there. And creating something out of nothing required that kind of entrepreneurial approach, and also required the use of policy innovations like charter schools in order to make it possible to actually produce schools, to deliver instruction, and hopefully to move children forward. And getting back to Leslie's main point, not simply to recreate what was there before, because that was unacceptable, but to really create something that was not just new and innovative for its own sake, but significantly better for the children and families of New Orleans.
Well, I have a slightly different spin to this answer. What I think people miss is everything was broken. So the conversation around schools might have been 5 to 10% of the conversation. Overwhelmingly, it was green dots. What neighborhoods were going to come back? How were they going to come back? I mean, people around the country were saying New Orleans should not be rebuilt. Probably the best thing we got was the grace of time, because while we were doing this, people were busy rebuilding their homes. I mentioned the power grid. I met an Ed Week reporter here in end of October, and it was an absolute ghost time that you were eating on paper plates and plastic, and there was no power except for like the French Quarter. So I don't think people can truly. It takes a lot of time to restart a city. The city was closed from August till January. I wrote the mayor, Nagin at that time, and Scott Cowan from Tulane, who was heading the Bring Back New Orleans Education, and we had lots of fights with Scott Cowan. Jim was very diplomatic. And to Dr. Francis Xavier, because everybody's coming back, and none of the stoplights were working at major intersections. I'm an insurance broker by nature. And so I say that in that we were given the grace of time. People did not really stop and start looking at the schools until like 2008. And by that time, we could show academic gains and start defending our thing. But to Dana's point, there's lots of people, but I want to call out New Schools for New Orleans and the nonprofit sector. So I teased Jim that the nonprofit sector was ready, aim, fire, and we needed ready, fire, aim. So I'm doing ready, fire, aim, and Jim and others are corralling the nonprofit sector for ready, aim, fire, because they wanted a whole proposal, and we're busy doing, but they came in big time with a ton of money, helped us get TFA here in large numbers. They seeded New Schools for New Orleans to incubate charter operators and do an all-call for people to come to the city. And this would never have succeeded without that engagement, because we did not have the local capacity to build. Now, this is happening over a 3-year period in what I'm describing right now. But as I said at the beginning, those 3 years are a blur. It's hard for any of us to remember the exact sequencing because it's happening so fast.
And I just, this is obviously Dana's organization now, but the importance of NSNO and Sarah Usden as the founder and Leslie as the inspiration was a critical piece, not only in helping to coordinate and organize work on the ground and helping to incubate new schools, create partnerships with folks like TFA and the New Teacher Project and New Leaders for New Schools, but also speaking now from a funder and from an outside organization perspective, providing a sort of common point of connection to the community and to the city that simplified the process of not only understanding what was on the ground, but figuring out how best to be supportive and how to allocate resources. And it was called, I think, inappropriately at the time as a harbor master, inappropriately because there was, too many water metaphors floating around, using another one. But this concept, I think, is one of those lessons learned out of the experience that has now been sort of extracted and replicated in other places as well.
It's so hard to zoom ahead by 8 years, but I'm going to try to zoom ahead by 8 years, or maybe even all the way up to up to today, if you want to, because we've already started to touch on this. But one of the things that is a question on my mind, and I think some of the minds in our audience, is the all charter system as it exists in New Orleans today, knowing that there's been sort of a robust nonprofit ecosystem that has evolved in the last 20 years alongside the school system, and that almost all of the schools in New Orleans are still charter schools. I think there's one now that is not, and they are authorized by the Orleans Parish School Board. Would love to just, if you can, zoom forward, which I know is hard, and think a little bit about how the all charter, near all charter system today makes it more or less difficult to meet the needs of all students in New Orleans, and the role that the nonprofit ecosystem plays in doing that as well.
Well, I'll jump in on that. I would say a couple of things. One, I think the only downside, the only downside to the system that we've created today is that we just really lack economies of scale, right? So it's more expensive to do certain things. We have had, I think, effective responses to that. So Leslie mentioned the differentiated funding formula as a way to get more money to schools who are serving kids with really high needs that can be expensive. But the school district also has created a centralized fund that can help schools sort of offset some of the costs associated with young people like that. But we also have schools in the sector that are innovating themselves in how to get better, more efficient at delivering services like that. If you look at, transportation, we spend, of course, a lot on transportation. So we lack some economies of scale, but I think we more than gain in the decision points being closest to those who are running schools and their ability to adapt in real time to the needs of young people. New Orleans, for all of its greatness, right? We have a lot of challenges that come along with kids to schools that schools need to solve for. And those challenges, if unaddressed, certainly can get in the way of learning for young people. And schools have been incredibly adaptive along the way. And that's certainly the benefit of being a charter, right? Having the autonomy to determine your curriculum and instructional methods, structure inside of organizational structure within your school, within your network, all in service of ensuring you can meet the bar that the local school system has set for you. So I think the things that we lose in economies of scale, we more than gain. And I think the data bears that out. We're plus 25 on graduation rates, plus 30 on college enrollment rates. We exceed the state average in the number of kids who go to college right out of high school. When you think about those data points today relative to 20 years ago, at the time when Leslie is describing, that would have been unheard of, right? There's zero failing schools in New Orleans, and we think you can contribute all of that to the autonomy of decision making in the hands of leaders inside of school buildings, the power of educators to create the types of schools that parents might be responsive to, and then the power of families to, again, vote with their feet and decide which schools they want to send their kids to. I think that combination, along with policy around, ERA and Doug Harris's research has shown the closure of schools and low performing schools in particular has led to some of the growth in student outcomes that we see. So I think we've benefited tremendously from a decentralized school system in the way in which it's currently structured, and we continue to be, I think, a place where innovation can happen, change can happen, and more rapidly. If you look at the bounce back from COVID, New Orleans is outpacing the state average in a state that's outpacing the country in academic recovery from COVID. And that's because we think we have good fundamentals in place in the type of system that we've built. And in some ways, we are working to centralize things that we think are important to be centralized. So, we are working on, we have a career center as a program where kids can get training in high wage, high demand careers, right? It is a centralized solution instead of every school trying to replicate that. So there are some pieces of the system that have been created to try and respond to that economies of scale issue.
So Julie, I think the real innovation of New Orleans, in my opinion, is not charter schools. It is creating a system of charter schools. So when you look at how is it meeting the needs of students, I totally agree with Dana. The autonomy, the focus on academics. So I was on the school board. I had someone clock it. We spent less than 5% of our time talking academics, and we were 90% of our time talking contracts and award ceremonies. Whereas charter renewal, they've got to first and foremost perform academically. So it drives a focus. You have some things that people don't think about. You have many more adults on the campus on a student adult ratio, because there is no, you don't have this huge central office that's been pushed down to the school site. In an overcapacity, the charter management organizations have been more motivated to self-correct and turn in charters. So far we have been downsizing without the turmoil that other urban districts are going through. I think we have higher caliber school leadership. The responsiveness to a crisis like COVID, to recovering from COVID, all those are strengths. We are a more entrepreneurial system, but I think there are unmet challenges in meeting the needs of kids. So we come in, we talked about the equity agenda. Give me just a minute to talk about it, because in the audience, you're going to have single shot charter operators or policy people. One of the first things I had to do was go to KIPP and say, you are backfilling. Because a lot of charters say, I'm going to grow one grade at a time, and if a student leaves, that's fine, but I'm not backfilling. If your entire system is charter schools, you have to backfill. You cannot have kindergarten and ninth grade be your entry points. That expanded to the whole equity agenda, that charter schools don't get to really pick who comes in their building because they're centralized enrollment. They don't get to pick how they expel the kids. There's centralized expulsion. They get control of what happens inside their school. So one of the things is, to make a system of schools, we had to impinge upon charter school autonomy. If you are a single charter school in Jefferson Parish, a neighboring district, you have far more autonomy than you do in New Orleans. We're more entrepreneurial, which probably 90% of the time is good. And the other 10% of the time, every one of them thinks they have to reinvent the wheel. So for example, when the state went to the new Common Core, they didn't want to look at what the state put in curriculum. They all thought their curriculum was better, and it wasn't. And so we lost ground and then had to recover. The cost of transportation, Dana mentioned, the failure of economy of scale in special ed. If you were a centralized district, you might have a school that specialized with neurodiverse kids, autism, or dyslexia, or hearing impaired. Every charter gets a special ed kid coming in, and they have to be able to serve the entire continuum of special needs kids. Calendar for parents is a real problem. Schools are not starting at the same time. They're not ending at the same time. They don't have the same holiday schedule. That is something we're going to have to address. Truancy is a problem. You're not getting a centralized answer to truancy the way you would in a central district. Recruiting teachers is more challenging. I go to DC, and because DC Public Schools is there, I don't know how much charters hire from DC Public Schools, but we don't have a central school district to cherry pick their good teachers from. So our innovation is rethinking what roles should a district do and what roles should a school do. And I would say we're still got more learning to do in that. There's still more things we have to keep figuring out.
And by the way, I just add to that. I mean, I do think that's this sort of creating a system out of independently managed charters or individually managed public schools is both challenging, but that's the key work and the work in progress in New Orleans, which is gradually producing the kinds of services and supports and infrastructure that is making it work and making it work effectively, and in many cases more effectively. But Dana, to your point about economies of scale, sometimes the assumption is, well, if we centralize it, it'll be cheaper because it's we're able to sort of consolidate all of the overhead costs. But that doesn't always turn out to be true. So I'm from Boston, and Boston has a choice system. I mean, there's some charter schools in there, but they're mostly district schools. But a choice system so that people are being bused in various parts of the city. And Boston is probably smaller than New Orleans geographically, or it's about the same size. It's not a big place. And we spend $180 million a year on transportation. And I don't know what New Orleans is spending right now, but I bet it's not that much. Right. So, and that's a centralized transportation system. So there's an assumption that if we centralize, things will be cheaper, more efficient. Unfortunately, I think it's not always true. So I think New Orleans is showing that there are ways to approach these problems and challenges a little bit more creatively, a little bit more flexibly, and in a way that hopefully is addressing the needs of students and schools more effectively.
Yeah. I'm certainly not suggesting we centralize transportation to
any
of our local stakeholders who are watching.
Well, this is a great conversation because I think, in some ways, Dana, I think you said earlier in the weeks, months, years after Katrina, it's not like you all were handed a blueprint. Here's what to do. But in other ways, Katrina became a blueprint for other cities, other urban systems that were looking to increase charter market share, increase choice, and learn from the New Orleans experience.
Yeah.
So I am curious to hear from all of you, what lessons you think leaders across the country should take from the New Orleans experience, and what do you think people get wrong about it?
I'll start with one lesson that I think people can take away, because a lot of what you will see in New Orleans is really uniquely designed around New Orleans and the way in which we evolved over the past 20 years, for sure. But I think this idea of schools should be held accountable for student outcomes is a non-negotiable now in New Orleans. Even if you are a staunch critic of the recovery school district, of the charter school reform piece of this, that group of people still are established that we're not going back to what we had, right? So as a community, we've sort of drawn a line in the sand around school performance, and outcomes are core to what we all should expect. Now, we've still got a long way to go before we can reach our dream that I'm sure we all share of every kid in New Orleans has access to an incredible public school. Like, we still got a lot of work to do to get there, some of what Leslie laid out and plus. But at the end of the day, I think as a community, we've established that for ourselves. And I believe we're probably the only, and we act on it. And so I'm certainly, we're the only parish across the state that really acts on it consistently, this idea of consequences for not for low student outcomes. And I think that can be replicated in other cities, other parts of the country. Doesn't mean it's not hard. Doesn't mean it won't come with a lot of pain. Like Leslie has laid out some lots of things that happen behind the scenes. At the end of the day, people still had to stand in the well at the meeting with parents and community leaders to take on the incoming from some of those decisions. But we've established for ourselves, I think, that as a value. And I think that value can be replicated.
One of the things that pops for me is you have to keep tending the garden. Entropy is an amazing force. We should not have a direct operated school in this city. It didn't perform very well. It wasn't needed. And you know, the warped view of what it was, just the nostalgia for something that never existed. And it is, I look at Denver, which was very pro-reform, and they lost school board elections and went backwards. So for folks listening, you know, if you're chartered by a local school board, you have to really pay attention to that local school board because it can flip on a dime. And school board elections, people don't pay a lot of attention to. So that would be my first takeaway is you have to tend the garden. And someone always has to be tending the garden because weeds grow really fast. Especially New Orleans, you know, we have lots of water. The second thing I think is a little bit of tempering of how great charters think they are, and I'm a huge charter fan, but there is so much de facto selectivity that goes in to when charters are not operating like a district. It can be not backfilling, it can be not doing transportation, it could be not handling the severe, profound special needs kids. So I think charters need to understand their codependence on a traditional district. And if you're moving to all chartering or significantly all chartering, you have to factor in, you know, our charters, any individual charter is not going to have the same results of charters in other locations where they don't have to be part of a centralized enrollment. They can ask parents to complete a form, which is again another form of selectivity, or they don't have to provide transportation. So to me, it's really going with eyes wide open as to what your role is going to be in that district and what you need from the district and what you want to take from the district.
That's, yeah, Jim, I was going to ask, given your role in many cities across the country, urban systems, what rings true here to you?
So, I mean, at the time, and to some extent still today, maybe a little bit less so, people around the country were both looking at New Orleans and asking themselves, well, is this something we can do here, or why aren't we doing this here, or why can't we sort of mobilize ourselves in the same way they did in New Orleans? Now, obviously, the circumstances that led to this transformation of the school district or the school system is not something anyone would want to replicate. But it just give you one example where there was an attempt to make that kind of full system transformation, not necessarily overnight, but relatively quickly, and that was in Newark, New Jersey. And you know, as people remember, Mark Zuckerberg and others committed, you know, many millions of dollars to the city in order to support the state receivership. Is specifically designed from their perspective to create a district that was predominantly, maybe not 100%, but predominantly charter. And that was in some ways very successful in that now something like 35% of the students in schools in Newark are going to charter schools. The charter school sector is very high performing. There have been a lot of very positive effects of all that, but it did not end up where people thought it would in terms of a system that was really dominated by charter schools. You know, part of the problem, of course, was just the way maybe that was managed itself. You know, Mark Zuckerberg goes on Oprah Winfrey with Cory Booker. They declare, you know, we're going to transform Newark. That didn't sit so well with the folks on the ground, but I'm not sure it would have under even the best of circumstances. But the local politics, as well as the state politics, associated with trying to make that kind of very painful transition from district control to a more decentralized school-based charter system is just extremely difficult. In New Orleans, you had state administration and at least some local leaders, Leslie being among them, of course, who, as she said, were tending the garden and maintaining that kind of persistent focus and hard work in order to move the process forward, to get over the bumps in the road, to get to the point where you could actually have a full system transformation rather than just a partial one. That's just turns out really hard to replicate. There are, elections that happen, and in Newark, there were a mayoral election. There was a change in the governor's office. There were all kinds of sort of controversies at the community level associated with the sort of the takeover and of low performing schools and the closure of low performing schools and turning them over to all of this stuff, which everyone is familiar with. But it leads to a sort of diminishing returns to the effort to make that transition, go beyond, let's say, 25% or a third. DC is up to almost 50% of a district. All of which is to say that, it could be that really the lesson, if there is a lesson here, is that the change has to be in other places, barring, similar circumstances, needs to be more incremental, but more persistent. And it's the latter part that's the hard piece to kind of get right. And Dana talked about accountability. That is so critical to the success of this effort. But even, sort of in Massachusetts, where I would like to think that our accountability system has produced tremendous results on a statewide basis, as well as in many of our urban communities. The political wind has gone out of those sails, and we're moving back rather than moving forward. And it's just, this is the moment we're in right now. The whole approach to standards-based accountability and student assessment is on the defensive, and in some cases, the defenses have already collapsed. So I'm worried that we're in a place where it's even harder now to consider a New Orleans-style reform in places where there are opportunities to do it. Unfortunately, I think a lot of the lessons we should have learned, positive lessons we should have learned from New Orleans, we're not taking up on.
I think the other, the flip side to your question, Julie, of, what do people get wrong about, about New Orleans? One of the things that sticks out for me is in order to accomplish any of what we've accomplished, it has taken a lot of effort by a lot of people, many of which are local to this community. And there is a perception that the change has been, is sort of outsider driven. And, yes, we've, had and been fortunate to have the contributions of philanthropy. We've had the benefit of Teach for America, which has done tremendous work over the course of the 20 years. But by and large, much of the change that has been driven here has been at the hands of people who are local and committed to this community, many of which were committed to this community, like Leslie, long before the storm ever showed up, right? People who were banging the drum about the need for change. And I think a lot of those contributions go unnoticed. It took really gutsy and courageous elected political leaders, both before the storm and after the storm, to do some of the things that, or to make way for some of the things that have happened in the legislature, on Bessie, on the school board, in local city council, and municipal elections. People in, and that's not to mention the hundreds of people who, like myself, came to this work as volunteer charter school board members, right? Rolling their sleeves up to say, hey, I want to contribute in some way, and seeing something really tangible, come from it, right? So we've just had this really, of course, now this was, to Leslie's point earlier, like how Katrina really damaged the entire city. It also sort of lit the spark across the city in terms of civic engagement and participation. If you were in this city between 2006 and 2010, like there was real energy, not just in the public school sector, but it was citizen-driven change all across the board. And our school system benefited from that citizen-led and driven change as much as any place in, amidst just any other area of life in the city. And I think that is largely goes undiscussed, unknown by a lot of people, because I think we draw to the sexy part, right? We're an all charter school system. Kids can go to school anywhere. This whole state takeover business, what was that about? And all those things were true, but I think they were made possible. They were came to be a largely successful effort because of a lot of citizen engagement. And those people deserve some kudos and some credit.
Absolutely.
I'll do one last unintended consequence, because Dana, you sparked that thought. I was walking in Audubon Park, for anybody who knows New Orleans, and a guy I knew growing up who never set foot in a public school, went to private school, you know, uptowner. And I'm walking and he stops me and he says, "What happens when a student comes mid-year? Do they count in accountability?" And I looked at him and I go, "You must be on a charter board now." And what happened is, we're a small city. You have now thousands of people who have served on charter boards. And so you brought our schools were totally segregated. They were 90 something percent African American. Affluent Black and white did not go to public schools unless they were few of the selective admission. And all of a sudden, these affluent people are serving on charter boards. So when we had a tax millage come up for the first time, it got equal or greater support from the white community than it did from the Black community, because all of a sudden people were viewing they were our schools instead of their schools. And I think people underestimate the power of charter boards, and that if you're looking to help tend that garden is, how do you cultivate these charter board members, maybe to run for the school board or to be able to go talk to the council or to use their networks, because they are engaging in schools in a way that they didn't in the past.
Love that. As a former charter board member myself, that definitely resonates.
Yeah.
I want to save a few minutes for questions from the audience at the end of this wonderful conversation. We have one already, but would invite others to submit anything else that is on their minds for our panelists to answer. The first one sort of breaks out of the charter school box of choice and is a question around what happened to parochial schools after Katrina. The audience member is asking about St. George's, Holy Name. These are names that are not familiar to me, but may be familiar to all of you. What did that look like?
So actually, my husband was on the board of Newman. So what happened to all the schools is all schools were closed, at least until January, and people moved. So like my nieces and nephews went to school in Lafayette and they were there for the year. So some people came back in January. So these schools opened in January and they opened to very small student populations. And like the public schools, they had to lay off a ton of their staff. The city really reopened for the start of the school year in 2006, where schools could open, but they all stayed in business. They all opened smaller populations, and then the population grew back. I mean, that was the story.
But there are fewer Catholic and parochial schools, just like there are fewer public schools today than there were before the storm.
Yeah, I mean, we've lost population.
And it sounds like maybe have been able to adapt a little bit more nimbly to the changes in population, given sort of the systems that have been set up in New Orleans as well. I'm curious, I want to go back to another question that I think really ties back to Leslie, something you said earlier. You painted a very evocative picture of flying back into New Orleans and there's no power and people are living in FEMA trailers and they're eating off of paper plates. What was the role of the schools? What did the schools do to address the trauma in the population after Hurricane Katrina?
Well, I remember it was insufficient because all the doctors left. We were so short doctors, and all the psychologists and psychiatrists left. They were overwhelmed. We partnered. I remember. So first of all, I just want to take you to what schools were. We took over all the schools. They were empty buildings. So we opened up on a little sliver of the city, but you can use none of the cafeterias because they have to all get re-inspected, and the city was not capable of re-inspecting them. You had no buses. You had to bring buses in. There's the picture that's gone all over of people stranded in the Superdome and all the school buses were sitting there flooding. But I remember the head of the RSD, the initial head was a woman called Robin Jarvis. And what she did is she had Tulane University come in and assess the kids. And all of them had such trauma that they took one session of coursework and they had social workers from Tulane come and try and do group sessions. A gentleman named Dr. Tony Rick Hasner, he reopened a school called Green Middle. And I remember it was a middle school. It reopened as a K-8. It was one of the schools in the Recovery School District. And he said, I remember telling me, we have to teach kids how to play again. When you look at these academic results, what's not captured, and I think Brookings tried to capture it, was these kids came back, a lot of them had been not in school, 4 or 5 schools, totally traumatized, and they're coming back and schools had to learn to deal with that. Even today, again, the Katrina babies have now graduated, but when a storm would come or we have to evacuate for hurricane, I mean, schools would definitely report more PTSD going on. So the unmet mental health needs were tremendous, and there just weren't the resources, and there still are not the resources to adequately address the mental health challenges our students have.
But there's a great story recently about a young man who works for us at New Schools for New Orleans, who was a Katrina child. I think he may have been in the in middle school when the storm hit. He is now in his 30s, early 30s, and he's our director of talent. And he talks about, he's a former teacher and an assistant school principal, and he talked about going to 4 different schools that year, that sort of 2005, 2006 school year. He went to 4 different schools around the state, and I think in Texas, and how ultimately when he got back to New Orleans, like the way he found himself and his way was through educators in his school buildings. So imagine educators in New Orleans who are experiencing trauma themselves, having lost much of their life, home, family, etc., but are responsible for tending to and nurturing a group of young people who are experiencing unnatural levels of trauma themselves. Like that whole piece, when you reflect on it, is tremendous. It really, those folks are deserving of hero status, quite frankly, in our community. And we would not have been able to recover and rebuild without that type of, consistent effort. And of course, we're fortunate now we're in this 20-year commemoration mode in the city where people are reflecting on this, and stories are being written about it and it being shared, because I think they're important stories.
Absolutely. Right. In the 2 minutes that we have left, I would love to invite you all to think forward for New Orleans and just share a brief thought, a sentence or two. What do you hope will be true for New Orleans over the next 5, 10, 20 years? Why don't we start with you, Dana? Go ahead.
Yeah, for me, it'd be like we're the first city that really figures it out for a majority of young people who are furthest away from opportunity. And I think if you look at the current pace that we're on, we're going to get there. Now, we want to accelerate that pace to get there sooner than later, but I think we've got the right fundamentals in place for our ecosystem and schools to really accomplish that. And I'm excited to be a part of it.
Jim, why don't you go next? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I mean, I guess the only thing I could say is to, keep on keeping on. As we were discussing a little bit earlier, persistence is, 90% of the game here. And the thing that really can set things back for kids and for schools is when you just sort of decide, well, that, we're done with that. Let's do something new just for its own sake. Or, the political wind shift and that ripples through the schools and the classrooms. I think it's really, that kind of stability and persistence, and in particular, persistence around things like accountability for results and for academic achievement and for college going and all those sort of post-secondary indicators and further economic mobility of students, keeping your eye on the ball around student outcomes, rather than thinking, well, this is all about, policy or politics or, special interests and what have you. And that's not easy to do. And that's why I think if New Orleans can keep doing it the way they've been doing it for 20 years, it's, things are just going to get better and better.
Leslie would love to give you the
Yeah,
closing word
I get the closing thing. I'm gonna echo Dana. I think my hope was we look in 5 to 10 years and really change the economic outcomes and opportunities for our graduates.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining this conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience members did as well. If you all are interested in our audience, but learning more about Bellwether, you can visit our website, bellwether.org. Sign up for our newsletter if you'd like as well. We'll be sending around a recording from this webinar for anybody who missed it, or anybody who wants to listen a second time through or catch something that they missed. And again, a reminder that we have another panel coming up later this week, which will be looking at career pathways innovations in New Orleans. And that is on Thursday at 12 p.m. Central Time. So thank you again to our panelists. Thank you all so much for joining this conversation today. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Julie.